A 29-year-old widow walked 4 miles through a Montana blizzard with a 3-week-old infant pressed against her chest and 2 small children at her heels, in sneakers with cardboard pressed into the soles, in temperatures the Billings Weather Service called the coldest night Copper Hill had recorded in 11 years. For 7 weeks, Della Morse had done everything right. She'd filed the reports. She'd sat in the waiting rooms. She'd taken the numbers and trusted every door that was supposed to open for her. 3 people turned her away in 11 minutes that Thursday night, the last one while calling the man who had sent her into the blizzard. With her newborn's lips showing the first faint blue of dangerous cold and less than 40 minutes of survivable warmth left in his tiny body, she crossed 34 feet of iced parking lot toward the one man in Copper Hill that everyone else crossed the street to avoid, and asked him 8 words. What Harlan Briggs had spent 7 weeks building to be airtight did not survive those 8 words. If that landed in your chest the way it does in mine, subscribe to Grace Riders, because this story is only just beginning. Drop your city in the comments and stay with me. You need to hear what those 8 words were. Are my kids safe if I stop walking? Those were the 8 words. And in the diesel and burnt coffee air outside Eastgate Gas and Supply on a Thursday night at 11:23, they landed like a handset flat on a table. Della Morse had been walking for 4 hours and 11 minutes. 4 hours since the collectors came through her apartment door without knocking, the 3rd time in 8 days, and she'd taken Michael from the bassinet in the bedroom closet where she'd moved it after the 2nd visit, and grabbed June's hand and told Arlo to hold onto her coat, and walked out into a storm that had already dropped 8 inches of snow and was promising more. She hadn't planned to walk to the gas station. She'd walked away from what scared her, which meant walking into the cold. She'd kept walking because stopping felt like surrender, and she couldn't afford surrender. She had 3 people depending on her continued movement. Dorena Ortiz would later tell the county record what Della hadn't yet allowed herself to calculate. Another 40 minutes in those temperatures and Michael's organs would begin showing stress. The medical term was mild hypothermia threshold. His core temperature had dropped to 85.1 degrees Fahrenheit. Another 40 minutes would cross a line that no warming could fully undo. Della didn't know the number. She knew the color. She could see it at the corners of Michael's lips, faint like a bruise just starting, every time the gas station's one working pump light caught his face. That was her countdown. Not 40 minutes. The color blue, deepening 1 degree at a time. The pump light hummed. That watery, electric fluorescent sound that fills the spaces between everything else. Diesel from the pumps. Burnt coffee drifting from the pot inside that had been on the burner since 7 that morning. Cold so sharp it had its own smell. Metallic, clean, punishing. Della's sneakers made a sound on the iced asphalt. A wet, dragging shuffle, uneven because she was favoring her right leg after 4 miles of walking on roads that hadn't been salted since the afternoon. Shuffle drag, shuffle drag. She stopped twice before she reached the parking lot's edge. Breathed, kept moving. June, 6 years old, had her fist wrapped in the back of her mother's coat at the hip. She hadn't asked where they were going since somewhere around mile 2. She'd stopped making that calculation. She was just walking. Arlo, 4, shuffled beside them with his eyes on the ground, too exhausted to lift his feet all the way. Della held Michael with both arms, despite what the cold had done to her right hand. 3 fingers white and hard where the frostbite was setting in. The skin feeling wrong, like a glove filled with something that wasn't her hand anymore. She shifted him so his face was at her collarbone, where the warmth was best. She'd been counting his breaths aloud in whispers since somewhere around mile 2. It wasn't a medically useful action. It was the only action available. The wool coat was soaked through. Her husband's coat, Gray and too large, the collar torn at the seam where one of the collectors had grabbed it and she'd pulled away. 2 buttons missing. The wind went straight through. Under it, a sweater with pulled threads at the hem. Jeans. The cardboard in the sneakers, which she'd cut from a cereal box because the rubber soles had split at the toe 2 weeks ago. Her lips were cracked and bleeding at the corners. The dark circles under her eyes had been there so long, she'd stopped noticing them in mirrors. Pale green eyes, watchful, exhausted, scanning everything that moved. On her right wrist, a plastic hospital bracelet. Michael's newborn ID band, his name in small letters, a tiny footprint. 3 weeks old, she'd kept it because it was the last thing that still had his name on something official. She'd been standing in the outer sort for 17 minutes before she made herself walk toward him. In those 17 minutes, she had tried 3 times. Rejection number 1 happened at 11:06 p.m. A truck with Copper Hill plates pulled up to the second pump, a couple in their 50s, finishing a late shift, heading home. The man was in the driver's seat. He looked through the window as he killed the engine, and his eyes found Della immediately. Her and the infant at her chest and the 2 children at her legs and the soaked coat and the sneakers with the split toe. He held that look for exactly 2 seconds. Then he reached across and tapped his wife's arm. Not urgently, just deliberately, and they both looked at the pump display. He paid at the reader without getting out. The truck pulled out of the lot without stopping. He had seen her see him. He'd held her eyes for 2 seconds, and he'd chosen the door locks anyway. That was rejection number 1, the kind where you don't register as a person. You register as a problem, and the safest thing to do with a problem on a late Thursday night in a blizzard is to not be standing near it when someone else decides to get involved. Della counted Michael's breaths. 1, 2, kept watching the lot. Rejection number 2 came at 11:14 inside the station. She brought the children in out of the cold, the bell above the door chiming, Arlo stumbling slightly on the threshold, and approached the counter where a man in his early 30s sat on a stool behind the register with his phone face down. He looked up, looked at the wet children, looked at Michael's dark-haired head above the coat collar, looked at Della. He said before she could open her mouth, "I can't have you in here scaring off customers. There's a shelter in Billings." He pointed to the door. Billings was 87 miles away on a highway the county had already begun closing in sequence. She had no car, no phone. Her phone had been taken during the first collector confrontation. No money that hadn't been frozen by a fraudulent court order. He almost certainly knew at least one of those things was true, and he said it anyway. That was rejection number 2, judgment operating as policy. He assessed her in 4 seconds. The soaked coat, the children, the cardboard insole sneakers, the general category of desperate woman in a storm, and decided she was a problem his shift wasn't designed to handle. The door he pointed to wasn't toward help. It was toward away. She brought the children back into the cold. Rejection number 3 was the one that changed something in her chest. Not broke it. There wasn't much left to break. Changed the shape of it. 2 men in reflective community watch vests pulled into the lot at 11:18. Copper Hill Community Safety Volunteers, local plates, fuel stop. They came towards her because they saw the infant, and that kind of visibility, a woman alone in a blizzard with a baby, was exactly what they were trained to notice. One of them had a kind face, the kind that makes you release something you have been holding. She started explaining. The collectors, the apartment, the debt she hadn't known existed, the man who'd come in with a master key at night. The taller one pulled out his phone. "Let me call someone who can help," he said. Something in Della's chest loosened. Not relief exactly, she was past the place where relief came easily, but the first softening of a wire that had been wrapped tight around her ribs since she'd walked out her door 4 hours ago. He called Harlan Briggs. She heard the name in his mouth, and it took half a second to understand why her stomach had dropped. Harlan Briggs, the property manager, the man who'd sent the collectors, the voice she'd heard in her own living room 11 days ago at 10:47 at night, standing in her apartment with the master key, thinking everyone in the apartment was asleep. The second volunteer positioned himself between her and the parking lot, casually, just standing there. The taller one waited for Harlan to answer, then looked at Della, and his voice was measured and certain and completely wrong. "You need to go home, sweetheart. Whatever trouble you think you're in, running in weather like this with a newborn makes it worse. Harlan's a good man. He'll sort this out." That was rejection number 3. Betrayal wearing a reflective vest and a reasonable expression. The people assigned to protect the community were protecting the man who had sent her into the blizzard. They had looked at her, a widow with frostbite and a newborn and a coat held together by grief, and decided that the man they knew was more real to them than the crisis standing in front of them. I want to pause here for just a moment because that volunteer is worth understanding. He probably went home that night believing he'd handled a difficult situation well. He'd made his calculation a long time before Della appeared in that parking lot, whose side was safer to be on, whose phone number was worth having in a town of 2,400 people. By the time she stood in front of him, that calculation was so old it felt like instinct. It wasn't cruelty. It was the shape of a man who'd stopped asking whether he was doing right and had started only asking whether he was doing safe. And in communities like Copper Hill, that calculation happens more often than anyone admits. Della understood what was happening before he finished the sentence. She took Arlo's hand. She walked back across the lot to the ice machine alcove on the east side of the building, far enough that they wouldn't see her without coming to look. She stood there. The wind hit her broadside. She pressed Michael tighter, and she looked through the station window at 5 motorcycles parked at the side lot. The men who belonged to them were near the door. She counted to 10. Then she counted Michael's breaths. Then she made herself walk. 34 feet across salted, iced asphalt, Ezra McCready was standing outside the station's side entrance when she came around the corner. 47 years old, 6'2", 224 pounds. Army, 82nd Airborne, 1999 to 2003, 2 deployments, 11 years as Copper Hill Charter President. The scar along his left jaw from a highway accident in 1991 caught the pump light. Full sleeve on his right arm disappearing under the Carhartt cuff. Gray at both temples. Left hand missing the ring finger. Lost offshore, never replaced with anything ornamental. The cut over the base layer. Waterproof gloves tucked in his belt. He'd been standing there for 12 minutes nursing a gas station coffee he'd forgotten he was holding, waiting for Jerome to finish a call, watching the blizzard. Most people in Copper Hill crossed the street when they saw the cut. Della Morse was out of streets to cross to. She stopped 3 feet from him, shifted Michael to her left arm. Her right hand, 3 fingers white, the frostbite making them clumsy, hung at her side. She looked at him, pale green eyes, exhausted, not afraid exactly, past afraid. Then she said it. "Are my kids safe if I stop walking?" Ezra set the coffee down on the ledge beside the door. He stepped forward, not toward her, between her and the open parking lot. Not aggressive, just present. A wall facing outward. His voice was quiet, the voice of a man who'd learned in 2 deployments that volume and authority had nothing to do with each other. "They're safe," he said. "You all are. Right now." He looked at Arlo, who was pressed against his mother's legs, staring up at him, and he crouched down to the boy's level and met his eyes and nodded once, slow. Then he stood, removed his cut, and laid it over Della's shoulders without touching her. Set it down like a flag. June, 6 years old, who had been suppressing her crying for most of the last 2 miles because she'd learned that crying made things harder, stopped. What he didn't know yet What none of them knew yet was that the plastic hospital bracelet on Della's wrist was about to point to a name in a filing cabinet that would change everything about what this night was. If you believe that no child should ever have to learn to suppress her crying, comment "I stand with Della" below and subscribe, because what happens inside that station changes everything. The truth came out in pieces, the way it does when someone has been carrying it alone for too long and finally finds somewhere to set it down. Ezra brought them in through the side entrance, not through the station proper, where the clerk was still watching through the glass, to the warmth of the door where his brothers were finishing their coffee. Jerome was off his call now and reading something on his phone. Road name Gravel, 58 years old. Former Billings PD detective, 22 years on the force, the kind of man who could assess a situation in the time it took someone else to notice there was one. He looked up. He saw the widow and the 3 children and his president's cut draped over her shoulders. He put the phone away. The man called Coldwater, 63, Vietnam-era combat medic, built from decades of hard work, the kind of man whose hands knew what to do before his brain finished the sentence, looked at Michael's face once and said quietly, "I need her inside." Now Ironside. They moved. No debate, no deliberation. Coldwater had thermal wrapping in his kit. He'd been carrying it for 15 years. He had Michael's temperature reading within 4 minutes of getting the infant into warmth. 85.1 degrees. He didn't say the number out loud. He looked at Ezra, and Ezra read it in his face. Inside, with Michael in warmth for the first time in 4 hours, Della began. Her voice was low and deliberate, each word placed carefully. The voice of someone who has been rationing the energy it takes to speak. "My husband died 7 weeks ago," she said. "Men came to the apartment 2 days after the funeral. They said he owed money, a consulting debt, $50,000. I'd never heard of it. I took my kids and I ran tonight." That was the surface layer, the version you lead with because it's the most believable. Gravel pulled out a small notebook. "Old habit, 22 years. He wrote, Morse, widow, 7 wokas, collectors, claim 50K. They came in without knocking," she said, 3 times. The second time they padlocked the refrigerator, told me it was inventory pending account review. A pause. "My daughter hasn't slept in a bed in 11 days. My son stopped asking when we're going home." Gravel's pen paused for half a second, then kept moving. Ezra noticed the hospital bracelet on her wrist when she shifted Michael. Tiny name in small print, tiny footprint, 3 weeks old. He didn't say anything. He looked at it longer than was necessary. "I went to the sheriff's office," she said. "A deputy took notes and told me it was a civil debt matter. He said the county court would be in touch. I never heard. I called legal aid in Billings. 6-week waiting list. The collectors came back before anyone called me." She drew a breath. "I asked my neighbor Frank Dooley to use his phone to call my parents. He said he didn't want trouble from those men. He locked his door." She said this with no particular inflection. Not because it didn't land, because she'd already been to the place where that kind of abandonment lives, and she'd had to walk past it to keep moving. Then she said the third thing, and Gravel stopped writing. "I heard the man on the phone," she said. "He came in with a master key. He was in my living room at 10:47 at night, and he thought everyone was asleep. I'd moved Michael's bassinet into the closet after the second visit." She paused. "He said the baby complicates optics, not the math. He said there was $247,300 and he wasn't leaving it on the table. He said I had until the end of the month." The fluorescent pump hum pressed through the wall. "He mentioned a name," Della said. "Denny Alcott. He said Denny thought he could stall him too, and that didn't end well for Denny." Nobody spoke for a moment. The end of the month. 6 days. Now I know what some of you might be picturing at this point. 87 Hells Angels in a Montana blizzard. You might expect what happens next to look like what Hollywood has decided men like Ezra McCready look like. Loud, fast, physical, boots on pavement and engines roaring toward a property manager's house before midnight. What actually happened was quieter. And precisely because it was quieter, it was permanent. Ezra sat down across from Della, not hovering, not performing. He sat the way a man sits when he has decided to give someone his full attention and the rest of the night can wait. "Tell me his name," he said. "Harlan Briggs," she said. Ezra looked at Gravel. Something moved between them without words. "Then the end of the month just changed," Ezra said. "You're not outside anymore. Nobody gets to you or those kids without going through 87 men first. And we don't move." He put one hand flat on her shoulder, the way you steady something fragile without gripping it. Then he looked at June directly. "You did good getting here," he said. June Morse, 6 years old, who had walked 4 miles in a blizzard suppressing her crying so her mother wouldn't have to carry it, looked up at a man in a road-worn cut and did not speak. But she stopped watching the door. And Ezra counted that as the most important thing that had happened all night. Jerome stepped outside at 12:08 a.m. His breath hung in the air in thick plumes. He called a number he'd had memorized for 18 years. It picked up on the second ring. Danny Ferraro, Billings chapter road captain. Road name Stitch. "It's Gravel. What time is it?" "Late. Listen." A breath. "I've got a 29-year-old widow out here in this storm, 3 kids, newborn with a temperature. She overheard a phone conversation that puts a local property manager into probate fraud, asset theft, and possibly a second death that nobody's looked at closely enough. She's got 6 days before $247,000 transfers away from her children forever." Wind through the overhead cables, 31 miles an hour now, the station's metal sign rattling its irregular rhythm. "This one did everything right," Gravel said. "Called the sheriff, called legal aid, asked her neighbors. Every door shut on her," he paused. "The man behind it has a community standing that makes the paperwork move through without friction. And there's a locksmith booked for 8 a.m. Friday that seals the last copies of evidence we can reach." Stitch said, "How many do you need?" "Everyone within range who can ride in this. I'll wake the chapter." A beat of quiet. "What's the baby's name?" Graveau looked back through the glass at Della, who had her hand over Michael's head, still watching the door, still counting. "Michael," he said, 3 weeks old. "We're rolling," Stitch said. "Keep the coffee on." The line went dead. By 12:47 a.m., the Copper Hill Charter had confirmed 41. The Billings chapter had confirmed 56. Nobody had asked for documentation. Nobody had requested proof beyond Gravel's word. They'd known him for 19 years. In 2 chapters of 97 men, that was sufficient. Inside the station, the work had already begun. Knotwood, 54, former high school counselor, trauma-informed in the way that only people who've spent years with children in crisis actually are, had sat down near June on the low shelf by the door without making a production of it. He produced a packet of peanut butter crackers from his jacket, held it out, didn't speak, didn't make eye contact in a way that asked something of her. June looked at her mother. Della nodded. June took the crackers. Knotwood stayed in her space, calm and unhurried, which was the only thing she needed. A signal that the adults around her weren't scared, which meant maybe the world wasn't ending, which meant maybe she could put her guard down one notch. Just one. Rim shot. 31, youngest in the chapter. Tech background, no record. The one who ran the chapter's digital operations had his laptop open before Della finished talking. Public records, business filings, Briggs Property Solutions, LLC. He said nothing to anyone for 6 minutes. Then, without looking up, There's a locksmith appointment booked for 8 a.m. Friday at Della's building. It's in Harlan's business calendar. Cloud synced, no password. Whatever she left in that apartment, Cole's employment paperwork, any original documents, gets sealed behind a new lock in less than 7 hours. He looked up. The appointment was added 11 days ago, same night she heard the phone call. The room understood the timing. Brimstone, 71, chapter founder, the kind of man who no longer needed to perform certainty because he simply had it, was sitting near the back. He'd been listening since they came in. He said one word, clock. That was the only instruction anyone needed. Gravel was already on his phone to a Garrett County attorney. The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. When he ended it, he wrote 3 words in his notebook. Emergency motion. Tonight. The children were with Knotwood and Coldwater. Michael's temperature reading 96.2 now, moving the right direction. Arlo asleep against Knotwood's arm with the complete trust of a 4-year-old who'd run out of reserves. When Ezra sat back down with Della, not an interrogation, not a procedure, 2 people with coffee cups and hard history between them. Walk me back, he said, before the collectors, before your husband died. What was Cole working? He was a miner, Copper Ridge mostly, but the last year he was doing some side transport work. Off the books, cash only, through Briggs. What was he transporting? She shook her head. He never told me. I think he didn't want me to. She looked at her hands. Around month 3, he said he'd seen a document exchange that bothered him. He wouldn't say what kind. He just said it made him uncomfortable. Ezra waited. He stopped taking the work, she said. After that, Harlan started noting things in the lease account. Irregularities, he called them. Cole said he felt like he was being watched. She paused. And then Cole died. Mining access road. Harlan's adjacent property. Ruled accidental. Ezra looked at his coffee for a long moment. When he said Denny Alcott's name on the phone, he said, "Did you know who that was?" "No," she said. "Not until tonight." He pulled his phone out and showed her a search he'd run while she was talking to Knotwood. Briggs Property Solutions, LLC, co-founders 2017. Denny Alcott, named in partner. Deceased January 2020. Single vehicle accident, rural Route 7. Weather related. Della looked at the screen. Something behind her eyes went very still. "He's done this before," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's what we're going to find out," Ezra said. He leaned forward, both forearms on the table, voice low enough that it wasn't performance, just fact. Cole saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Harlan built a paper trail that made your husband's death look like an accident and your debt look like a legal obligation. He's had 7 weeks to work those papers through a county system that doesn't move fast enough to catch him before a deadline he set himself. He looked at her straight. "You've done everything right. The system failed you. That's on the system, not on you. But from right now, tonight, you don't fight this alone." What he didn't tell her yet, what Rimshot had just confirmed and was already building a file around, was that the locksmith appointment wasn't only about sealing the apartment. The calendar notation beside it read, "Dispose Cole file. Final." Harlan Briggs had known for 11 days exactly what he needed to destroy. He'd given himself until 8 a.m. Friday to destroy it. Ezra stood. He looked at Gravel across the room. "We move before 8, he said. "All of it." Gravel said, "I know." Outside, the first sound reached them through the wall. Low, distant, rising. The rumble of engines fighting through blizzard roads from Billings. An hour out and moving. By 2:43 a.m., the last of the Billings chapter had come off Route 9. You could hear them before you could see them. The sound built the way real thunder builds. Not a crack, but a pressure shift. Something you'll feel in the sternum before your ears catch it. Low and continuous, then layered, then enormous. 97 engines in a Montana blizzard, moving in formation, headlights cutting through snow so dense it has swallowed the beams 10 feet out and threw the light back diffuse and white. They came in rows, disciplined. No stagger, no rushing. The choreography of men who had ridden together long enough that the formation was muscle memory. They pulled into the lot in sequence, not all at once, because 97 motorcycles all at once in a space that size is chaos. And this was not chaos. It was the opposite of chaos. It was decision made visible. They parked in the overflow section and along the south edge of the lot and lined the service road in 2 rows facing the station. Engines cut as, not staggered, almost synchronized. And the silence that came after was the kind of silence that has weight. 1 minute of roaring engines and then nothing, and the nothing felt like presence. 97 men in cuts, standing in a Montana blizzard at 2:43 in the morning, not moving, not shouting, not performing anything. Just there. The station clerk, who had told Della Morse 2 hours ago to leave and pointed toward a shelter 97 miles away, stood behind the glass with his phone in his hand. He did not make a call. I know what you might be expecting at this point. You've heard stories about what men in cuts do when they're angry. You've seen what Hollywood decides 100 motorcycles means when someone has been wronged. Fists, doors coming off hinges, a property manager's window getting introduced to a fist. What actually pulled into that lot was something the county sheriff's department would describe in its report the following morning as, and this is verbatim, an organized, lawful community response displaying exemplary discipline under difficult conditions. That report would be signed by a man named Harlan Briggs, was HOA neighbors with. But before that report existed, there were gravel and rim shot at Briggs Property Solutions on Merchant Road downtown, with a county emergency motion granted at 2:18 a.m. by a judge. Gravel had testified before 11 times in 22 years, and a locksmith they'd called themselves, and the right to enter and preserve evidence that Harlan Briggs had intended to eliminate in 5 hours. Louise Farron was 61 years old and had lived in Unit 4C of Briggs Property Solutions, Pine Ridge Complex for 9 years. She was awake when Gravel knocked at 2:59 a.m. She'd been awake for most of the last 2 weeks. He introduced himself, road name, former badge number, the judge's order, the reason for the hour. He did not perform authority. He simply explained what was happening and asked if she would be willing to talk. She was. She'd seen the collectors enter Unit 2B without knocking on 3 separate occasions, she said. The first time she'd come into the hallway because she'd heard the door bang, not knocked, but hit hard enough to frame vibrate. And she'd seen 2 men she didn't recognize going in while Della was still reaching for the handle from inside. She'd heard Della's voice saying something she couldn't make out, and one of the men saying clearly, "We're authorized. Don't make a scene." She'd seen them leave 40 minutes later with a padlock in one of their hands. "I should have called someone," she said. Her hands were folded on the kitchen table, very still. The stillness of a person who has practiced managing the physical signs of guilt. I called the property office the next morning, left a message. Nobody called back. She paused. The day after that, I saw one of Harlan's handymen changing the lock on the mailboxes. Not just 2B's mailbox, all of them. I told myself, it must be some kind of management thing. She couldn't meet Gravel's eyes when she said the next part. I knew something was wrong, I just didn't want to be the one who made it worse. That sounds terrible. Saying it out loud, I know how it sounds. Gravel wrote. He didn't respond to the apology because the apology wasn't something he could give her relief from, and giving her relief from it wouldn't serve Della Morse. What Louise provided, a first-hand account of unlawful entry, a description of both collectors, including one with a distinctive scar along his right forearm, And a name, Vukov. She'd heard one of them use when they didn't realize the hallway had acoustics. Ray Holbrook was 77 and had been Garrett County assessor for 21 years before he retired. He was reached by phone at 3:14 a.m. and agreed to speak immediately. He'd noticed the trusteeship filing, Cole Morse's estate, trustee listed as Harlan Briggs, when it crossed through his former office's system 4 weeks ago, routed to him by a clerk who still sometimes asked his opinion out of habit. It was wrong on its face, he said. His voice on the phone was the particular steady of a man who has spent decades being precise. A surviving spouse with minor children doesn't lose trusteeship rights to a property manager unless a court has specifically granted it for documented cause. There was no court grant in that file, the notarization signature I didn't recognize. I flagged it. To whom? I emailed the Sheriff's Civil Division. I was told it had been reviewed and was in process. A pause. That was 28 days ago. Rimshot, sitting at the table beside Gravel with his laptop open, pulled the email from the county civil records archive in 6 minutes. Ray Holbrook's flag had been received, logged, assigned a case number, and closed without action 3 days later. The closing notation read, "Reviewed, civil matter under active management. No intervention indicated." The man who closed it had worked in that office for 6 years. He coached Little League. He'd been coached by Harlan Briggs. That was the final rung of the institutional failure ladder. Not incompetence, not bureaucratic delay, not a system too slow to catch up. A system being used deliberately by someone who knew where the levers were and which hands held them. The narrator has to pause here for something I want to say directly to you. There were 3 people who saw pieces of this. Louise, who watched the collectors enter without knocking. Ray, who flagged a fraudulent filing. Sandra Cobb, former food bank volunteer who watched Harlan remove Della's name from the emergency food list 11 days before she walked into that blizzard, citing pending account resolution. A phrase with no legal meaning that Sandra had accepted because Harlan said it calmly and he was on the board. 3 people who saw something that wasn't right and did what we all do when we see something we don't understand fully. They reported it to the next person up. They assumed the next person up would know what to do. Nobody assembled the 3 pieces until a man named Gravel sat down in a woman's kitchen at 3 a.m. and asked the first of them to tell him everything she'd noticed. That's not an accusation. That's a description of how these things survive. Not because the people around them are evil, because evil, when it's patient and well-positioned, can survive any individual report as long as those reports never reach each other. The filing cabinet marked closed accounts was in the basement of Briggs Property Solutions, padlocked with a separate key. Rimshot did not pick the lock. The emergency preservation order covered the space. The locksmith they'd brought cut the padlock at 3:27 a.m. Inside, in a hanging folder behind 2 years of routine lease records, Cole Morse, employment documentation. Not the off-books transport records. Those didn't exist on paper, but something more useful. A text chain printed between a number registered to a burner and a number belonging to a Vukov-affiliated contact, referencing the Morse route in Phase 2 window. A calendar notation in Harlan's handwriting, dated 10 days before Cole's death. See, timeline moved up, notify V, and behind that folder, a second folder, older, thinner. The name on the tab was Alcott D. Gravel opened it. Inside was a life insurance document, Briggs Property Solutions Business Continuation Policy, single premium, sole beneficiary Harlan Briggs. Payout on record, $163,700. Date of policy update, 6 weeks before Denny Alcott's vehicle went off rural Route 7 in January 2020 on a road Denny Alcott reportedly never used. And behind the policy, stapled to it, a copy of a complaint filed with the Montana Business Registry dated 8 days before Denny's death. Denny had flagged financial irregularities in the partnership accounts. The complaint had been signed and dated and never assigned a case number. Nobody spoke for a full 20 seconds. The refrigerator in the break room upstairs hummed. Somewhere outside, a motorcycle idled and cut. The snow was still coming down. Gravel said very quietly, "He's done this twice." Rimshot closed his laptop, opened it again, made 3 keystrokes. Then, there's a third name in the 2016 account records. A tenant, Lena Vardis, listed under closed accounts. Deceased notation, estate resolved by trustee. No other information. The number of people Harlan Briggs had decided were worth less than a clean financial transfer might be 3, might be more. What they had in their hands, the text chain, the calendar notation, the Alcott policy, the Vardis account, and Della's verbatim memory of a phone call she'd been repeating to herself every hour so she wouldn't lose it, was enough. Gravel said, "Get the FBI liaison on the phone." The man with the coward's face was named Phil Dantry, 44 years old, partner at Garrett County's only full-service title company. Dantry and Associates had notarized the trusteeship amendment. The signature on it wasn't Cole Morse's. Gravel knew that the moment he saw it, 22 years of document experience, but it had Phil Dantry's notary stamp, which meant Phil Dantry had either been present for a forgery or had applied a stamp to a document he hadn't witnessed. Gravel found him at his home address at 4:11 a.m. Phil Dantry answered the door in a bathrobe, in the expression of a man who has been waiting for this knock for a long time and had spent that time convincing himself it wasn't coming. Gravel set the trusteeship amendment on the table between them. He set the Alcott policy beside it. He set Rimshot's printed summary of the financial transfer timeline beside that. He let Phil look. Then he said, "Tell me everything from the beginning, or I make one call and you answer to people with considerably less patience than I have right now." Phil Dantry began talking in under 90 seconds. Once he started, he didn't stop for 41 minutes. What he said, Harlan had brought him the trusteeship amendment in November, said it was a routine estate management document, that the widow was incapacitated and had verbally consented, that everything just needed a notary stamp to clear probate. Phil had been handling Harlan's documents for 11 years. He'd never asked too many questions. He'd told himself that was how professional relationships worked. He'd known somewhere under that something was wrong. The widow's name was on the document. She should have been there. He'd stamped it anyway. The weight of it, Gravel said later, was in that last sentence, not in Phil Dantry's corruption. He wasn't corrupt in the way Harlan was, wasn't a predator, wasn't calculating deaths. He was a small man who had traded his integrity so gradually over 11 years that by the time the trade became this, he'd forgotten what integrity felt like. He'd told himself he was just a notary, just a stamp, just a professional facilitating another professional's document. That kind of self-deception doesn't make a person less responsible. It makes the damage harder to see until someone is standing in a Montana blizzard at 11 at night with a newborn's lips turning blue. The FBI field agent's name was Renata Voss. She was 43, out of the Billings field office, wearing plain clothes when she arrived at the Eastgate Gas and Supply at 4:55 a.m., a woman who looked like she hadn't slept the previous night either, which, as it turned out, she hadn't. Ezra watched her walk across the lot from the side entrance. He did not go to meet her. He let her come. She introduced herself. Name, office, 2 sentences. He acknowledged with a nod. Didn't extend his hand. She said, "I'm told you have something relevant to an open federal investigation." He said, "Depends on what you're investigating." A pause. She said, "Harlan Briggs." Ezra looked toward the station window, where Gravel was inside with his phone and a notepad and 4 hours of work assembled on the counter. Then he looked back. "How long has your office known about Briggs?" he said. The agent held his look. She took a breath before she answered, and that breath said everything. 14 months, she said. "We've been building a financial fraud case. Legally, carefully. We needed the pattern to be unambiguous before we moved." 14 months. Delamorse's husband had been dead for 7 weeks. The collectors had been inside her apartment 3 times in 9 days. Her son had stopped asking when they were going home. Ezra said, "We got her out in 4 hours. You had 14 months." Agent Voss had no answer that would be good enough. He hadn't asked the question because he wanted one. He'd asked it so that she would understand clearly what the next hour needed to look like. They went inside. Gravel laid the evidence out as a physical sequence. The text chain placed on the counter first, face up, the Alcott policy folder beside it, the calendar notation, CM, timeline moved up, Notify V, beside that, Rimshot's financial summary, 3 pages, placed last. Then he set his phone face up and played 41 minutes of Phil Dantry, starting at the part about the notary stamp. Agent Voss reviewed each item. When she got to the Alcott policy and the 6-week gap between the update date and the death date, she set her pen down, leaned forward, removed her glasses. She said, "We had the financial trail going back to 2018. We didn't have the document chain, and we didn't have Alcott." She looked at Ezra. "If Dantry's statement holds and the document forensics confirm the forgery on the trusteeship, the charges expand significantly. Interstate fraud, forgery, probate violation. And if the text chain connects to Vukov's organization, we're looking at a federal RICO component." Ezra said, "Delamorse gets a victim advocate assigned before the first interview. Nobody talks to her without her asking first." "Agreed," Voss said. "Second," he said, "the locksmith at 8 a.m. Friday doesn't change those locks. Your people go in with county preservation order and pull the remaining files first." "Already in motion," she said. She picked up her pen, made a note. "We'll be in touch." "Agent Voss," she turned. "You do right by her." "A beat. That's the job," she said. She walked out. The station door closed behind her. The pump light hummed. The system hadn't been broken. That was the thing people would get wrong when they talked about this later. They'd frame it as bikers versus bureaucracy, the outside force versus the slow machine. But the FBI had been building this case for 14 months. They'd been doing it correctly, carefully, the way a case built to survive appeals has to be built. They couldn't move fast enough on their own. Della couldn't wait 14 months for them to be ready. What happened that night wasn't bikers replacing the system. It was 4 hours of human urgency, buying the time the legal machinery needed to do its job properly. The brothers had filled the gap, and the gap was the distance between process and a newborn's temperature. Harlan Briggs was not, at 6:41 a.m. on Friday, doing anything that could be described as the behavior of a man who understood what was coming. He was at his kitchen counter in the house on Ridgeline Estates, in clean work boots and a fleece vest over a button-down scrambling eggs. The radio was on. Farm report, commodity prices, weather. He had his wireframe glasses on and a spatula in his hand. He'd called the locksmith at 6:30 to confirm the 8 a.m. appointment. He was, by all appearances, a man starting a normal Friday. When the front door came open, federal warrant, county sheriff's deputy, Agent Voss, and 2 additional Billings field agents. He turned from the stove with the spatula still in his hand. His expression was confusion first, not performed confusion. Genuine because he had told himself for long enough that he believed it, that the infrastructure he'd built was airtight. The confusion lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then the training kicked in. He set the spatula down. He straightened slightly. His shoulders dropped from defensive to the carefully relaxed posture of a reasonable man welcoming conversation. His head tilted, an almost imperceptible, self-deprecating exhale, the breathing pattern of someone who is about to explain a misunderstanding. "I'm sure there's something we can clear up here," he said. His voice was measured and slightly folksy. "My door is always open. That's how we do things around here. Whatever the concern is, I'm happy to cooperate completely." He named 2 county commissioners by first name. He referenced 14 years of community standing. He mentioned the food bank board and the Little League and the HOA. Agent Voss let him finish. She did not respond to any of it. Gravel, who was standing in the entry behind the federal agents as a county witness, had asked him, before he could continue, one question. "Mr. Briggs, what was the exact dollar amount of the wrongful death settlement from Cole Morse's workplace accident?" Only the person who had drafted that document, who knew it existed at all, would know that number. Della Morse hadn't known. The sheriff's office hadn't known. The number was buried in a fraudulent trusteeship filing that Harlan had navigated specifically to keep it from surfacing. Harlan's expression held for exactly 1 second past the point it should have. 1 second where the charm and the reasonable expression and the community standing inventory lived on his face, trying to find the right answer, and couldn't. 1 second is enough. He pivoted. His voice didn't change tone, but the content shifted entirely. "I want to be very clear," he said, "that what you're doing right now constitutes false imprisonment. I am a private citizen on private property. My attorney will have this dismissed before the county courthouse opens. I have a documented relationship with the Garrett County Civil Division. One phone call ends this." He looked at Agent Voss. "Your office will hear from counsel by 9 a.m. Nobody in the room reacted, not a flinch, not an exchange of glances. 97 men had been standing in a blizzard since before 3 in the morning. A legal threat from a man with a spatula was not a new pressure. Ezra said, "You're welcome to call your attorney. The FBI is going to want to talk to them anyway." The word FBI landed in the kitchen the way a stone lands in still water. Harlan Briggs went very quiet. Something behind his eyes made a calculation he hadn't made before, and the result of that calculation was not good. He tried the last thing left. His voice dropped. He spoke about the stress of the past year, the difficulty of managing estates and grieving families, how much he'd sacrificed trying to help the Morse situation stabilize, how this was a misunderstanding born of grief and poor communication, and his only goal had been to protect the family's assets. He was not performing anymore. He genuinely believed this version. He told it to himself long enough that it had become the version that felt true. Gravel said, "I'm not interested in your reasons, neither is she." 6 words, quiet, and that was the end of it. Harlan Briggs stopped talking. His hands, which had been open and slightly raised, the rehearsed gesture of a man inviting trust, closed, not into fists, just closed. The performance stopped, and nothing replaced it. The face underneath was neither monstrous nor terrifying. It was the face of a man who had run out of tools, which was not the same as a man who felt remorse, just a man with no remaining move. He was read his rights in his own kitchen. He asked once quietly if someone could call his neighbor about a delivery he was expecting. Not his attorney, not his family. A delivery. As if the thing that needed sorting in this moment was his correspondence. The scope of it, assembled by 6 a.m. at Eastgate Gas and Supply with Agent Voss's team, cross-referencing Rimshot's documentation. 3 confirmed victims. Cole Morse, deceased. Denny Alcott, deceased. Lena Vardas, whose estate had been resolved in 2016 without her family's knowledge. A 4th case in early investigation, a previous tenant whose rent records showed the same rotation pattern, 11 months, Then a closed accounts notation. Total stolen and fraudulently acquired across the confirmed cases. $412,000. The Morse settlement alone, $247,300. Still pending transfer, now frozen by federal hold pending investigation. Timeline of operation, at minimum 9 years, beginning with the Vardas case in 2015. Charges filed or in filing, probate fraud, document forgery, unlawful entry, deprivation of property under fraudulent legal authority, RICO conspiracy related to the Vukov network used for property security, and mobile, pending medical examiner review of both Alcott's and Cole Morse's accident scenes, a further investigation into whether either death had been assisted. That last part was not in the official statement. It was what Gravel said to Ezra quietly while the federal agents worked, and Ezra said nothing back. Just stood with his coffee, watched the snow outside, which had finally slowed to something lighter. $412,000. 9 years. 3 deaths being reconsidered. And in the corner of the gas station, Della Morse was sitting with her hand over Michael's head, counting his breaths. His lips were pink now. His temperature had been reading normal for 2 hours. The hospital bracelet was still on her wrist. Michael's name. Tiny footprint. 3 weeks old. Ezra looked at it from across the room. He kept looking at it longer than necessary. The first safe thing that happened was small enough that nobody would have written it down. At 7:12 a.m., Coldwater set a paper cup of hot chocolate, not coffee. He'd specifically asked the clerk for the powder packet and hot water, on the shelf beside Della, at the height where June could reach it without asking. June looked at it, looked at Coldwater. He was already facing the other direction, talking to Knotwood in a low voice about something unrelated. She picked it up with both hands, drank it standing up slowly, watching the room. That was the first safe thing. The housing question was settled before 8 a.m. because Ezra had made 3 calls while the federal agents were still at the kitchen counter at Briggs Property Solutions. The third call was to a woman named Carol Timmons, 64, retired school teacher, owned a 2-bedroom rental on the east edge of Copperhill that had been sitting empty since October when her last tenants moved to Billings. Ezra had known Carol for 11 years. He'd shoveled her driveway once in 2019 when she'd had a bad knee and he'd been passing on Route 9. She hadn't asked him to. He hadn't mentioned it afterward. Carol picked up on the 4th ring. He told her what had happened. She said, "How long do they need?" He said, "As long as it takes." She said, "The heat's already on. I never turned it off. Tell her she can bring the children." The chapter raised $9,300 by noon Friday, not from any formal request, just from the network activating the way it activates when word moves through 97 men who know other men. The Billings chapter contributed $4,400. The Copperhill charter matched it. $800 came from a retired mail carrier in Missoula, whose son-in-law was a Billings chapter associate. The total covered 3 months of rent, a full grocery run, and the gap between whatever legal aid would eventually provide and the immediate cost of having a family attorney file on Della's behalf to unfreeze the Morse estate. That attorney was named Patricia Hearn. She drove from Garrett County in the snow. She charged nothing for the first consultation and agreed to a contingency arrangement on the estate claim. She was in her early 50s, compact and direct, the kind of woman who communicated primarily through precise language and had no patience for equivocation. She sat across from Della at the gas station counter at 8:45 a.m. with a notepad and said, "Tell me what you know. Start with the phone call." Della told her everything, every word she'd memorized and repeated to herself every hour since 10:47 p.m., 11 days ago, so she wouldn't lose it. Patricia Hearn wrote it all down. Then she said, "That verbatim recall is evidence. Do not minimize that in your own mind. What you remembered was an act of self-preservation that may directly determine the outcome of your children's financial future. Della looked at her for a moment, the pale green eyes exhausted still, but something behind them slightly less clenched. Nobody said that to me before, Della said. Then I'm the first, Patricia said. The medical visit happened at 9:30 a.m., Copper Hill Family Clinic, 3.5 miles from the gas station. Coldwater drove. He had a 2004 pickup, not a motorcycle, which mattered, and he'd had it warming in the lot since 6 a.m. He put a clean fleece blanket on the back seat for the children without mentioning it. Dorena Ortiz was already at the clinic when they arrived. She was in her mid-40s, dark-haired, the kind of doctor whose manner communicated that whatever you tell me will not shock me, which for Della Morse on a Friday morning after a Thursday night like that one was the most useful thing a doctor could project. Michael's examination took 22 minutes. His temperature was 98.1. His weight, 6.4 pounds at the gas station reading, was consistent with the feeding disruption he'd experienced over the previous 11 days. Dr. Ortiz prescribed a specific formula supplementation schedule, reviewed Della's postpartum status, and addressed the frostbite on 3 fingers of her right hand, which had not progressed past early stage 1, but required twice daily monitoring for the next week. She looked at the 3 white-tipped fingers without expression. Then she said, "You kept him warm through 4 miles in a blizzard and with frostbitten hands." Della said, "I kept both arms around him the whole time." Mr. Ortiz nodded slowly. She wrote something on the chart. Then she looked through the open door to the waiting room, where Coldwater was sitting in a plastic chair with Arlo asleep across his lap and June carefully studying the fish tank in the corner. She looked back at Della. "Thank you for getting here when you did," she said quietly. The fluorescent hum of the clinic lights was the same sound as the gas station pump light, same watery electrical tone, different room, different weight to the air inside it. Della noticed that. The same sound in a different room, how it could carry terror one place and something softer somewhere else. She didn't say that to anyone. She filed it somewhere. The key to the Timmons rental was a standard house key on a simple ring, no tag, nothing decorative. Carol Timmons handed it to Della at 11:15 a.m. in the driveway of the house on Eastbrook Lane. Carol was in a wool coat and boots, had driven over to turn the heat up from the remote setting and put bread and eggs and a container of soup in the kitchen. She didn't mention that. She just handed over the key. Della looked at the house. 2-bedroom, 1-story white siding with a green door. A front window with light visible through it because the heat was on and the lamp inside had been left lit. A front walk someone had salted that morning. She stood there for a moment in the doorway. Arlo beside her looked up at the lamp in the window and said his first full sentence since mile 2 of the blizzard the night before. "Is that our light?" Della's hand on his shoulder tightened once. "Yes," she said. "That's our light." She crossed the threshold. Knotwood came by that afternoon with a bag of art supplies. Not a generic selection. He'd stopped at the hardware store's small school section and thought about it for a few minutes, which was how he ended up with the specific combination of washable markers in June's apparent preferred colors. He'd noted which colors she'd reached for in the station when he'd produced a notepad to keep her occupied. In a small model car kit for Arlo that was designed for ages 4 and up and required assistance, which meant it required adult interaction in a way that made it a gift of time as much as materials. He left the bag on the front porch, knocked. When Della opened the door, he said, "I know you need quiet." "I just wanted the kids to have something to do." He handed her a card with his number. "Anytime, day or night. That goes for the kids too, if they want to talk to someone who isn't family." He paused. "Sometimes that's easier." He left before she could answer. Rimshot came by at 3 p.m. with a burner phone charged and loaded with his contact, Patricia Hearn's contact, Ezra's contact, and the non-emergency line for Garrett County's Victim Services Division, which had a different staff from the civil division and had not, he emphasized, been involved with the same deputy who had classified Della's initial report as a civil debt matter. He set it on the kitchen table. "It's in your name," he said, "already paid for 3 months." He looked around the kitchen briefly, not nosily, just checking in the way someone who'd been up for 24 hours checks to confirm things are where they're supposed to be. Then he looked at Michael, asleep in the car seat cold water had produced from somewhere and left at the clinic. "He's got good color," Rimshot said. "He does," Della said. Rimshot nodded then, "Call if anything feels wrong, I mean anything." He was already heading for the door. At 21 years younger than most of his brothers, he sometimes defaulted to efficiency when he couldn't find the right words. He found them at the threshold. "You knew what you heard on that phone. You kept it. That mattered." He left. Brimstone came last. 7 p.m. by himself, no bike. He'd come in a truck, which surprised Della when she saw him at the door. 71 years old, the chapter founder, the man who'd said one word in the gas station at 4 a.m. and set the clock for everyone in the room. He had a casserole in a baking dish covered in foil, held it out without ceremony. She took it. He looked at June, who was standing behind her mother's leg in the doorway, watching him with the serious, assessing attention of a 6-year-old who has learned to read faces carefully. He crouched down, slowly, his knees didn't bend like they used to, and looked at her level. "Your mom did something very brave," he said. "Walking to us the way she did. You helped her do that." June said nothing. She just looked at him. Then she nodded once with the gravity of someone for whom the fact has been true for a while, and she's only now hearing it acknowledged by someone outside the family. Brimstone stood up. He looked at Della. He didn't make it long. "You've got good people around you now," he said. "Let them help." He turned to go, then from the walk, "The soup's good. The wife made it." He got in his truck. He drove away. Della stood in the doorway for a moment with the casserole dish and the warm weight of it and the lit lamp behind her. Then she went inside. She locked the door. And the sound of the lock catching, that small, certain mechanical click, was the first time in 11 days that sound had meant safety. She stood in the hallway and listened to June in the next room, explaining the washable markers to Arlo with the confident authority of an older sibling. Michael was asleep. The heat was on. There was food in the kitchen. She didn't cry. She was past crying and not yet at the place where crying was relief rather than expenditure. But she counted her children's breaths. 1, 2, 3. The habit she'd built in the dark over the previous weeks. And this time, for the first time, counting them felt like gratitude rather than calculation. Ezra was back at Eastgate Gas and Supply at 8:20 that night. He hadn't planned it. He'd been on Route 9 heading east after meeting with Agent Voss's team for the 3rd time that day. A debrief on the Vukov connection, which had opened into a larger organized crime thread that the Billings field office was now coordinating with the state. He'd turned in before he decided to. The lot was empty, one working pump light. The clerk was different. The day shift. A woman in her 50s who set a coffee on the counter without asking them when he came in and said, "You're the man who was here last night?" "Yeah," he said. She brought it without commentary, set it down, walked away. He sat at the counter with his hands around the mug, looking at the space near the side door where Della had stood. He could see it clearly. The soaked coat, the cardboard insole shuffle of her sneakers on the iced asphalt, the way she'd stopped twice before she reached him, the way she'd shifted Michael to her left arm before she asked the 8 words, the way June had stopped watching the door when he laid his cut over her mother's shoulders. He pulled up the photo on his phone. He'd taken it quietly at the clinic that morning. The hospital bracelet on Della's wrist, Michael's name in small letters, the tiny footprint, the 3-week date stamp. He hadn't asked her permission. He'd looked at it for a long time in the clinic's parking lot before he'd put his phone away. His nephew's name was Trevor. He'd been 9 when the trail went cold. That was 2009, 15 years ago. Ezra had driven every route between Copper Hill and Billings at least twice in those first years, looking for a thread. He'd filed reports, he'd made calls, he'd done what the system asked of him, and then he'd kept going when the system stopped. Trevor's trail was cold. That was the truth, and Ezra had learned to carry it rather than fight it. The weight of a loss that didn't resolve, that simply became part of the architecture of who you were. He hadn't saved Della Morse because of Trevor. He'd saved her because she'd stood in a blizzard with frostbitten hands and asked 8 words, and there was no version of himself that could hear those 8 words and choose the door locks. But Trevor was why he understood, without having to be told, what it looked like when a child stopped asking when they were going home. Why he'd looked at Michael's hospital bracelet for longer than necessary. Why he'd told June she'd done good getting there. Because he knew that someone should have said it. And he also knew that if nobody said it when a child was 6, sometimes nobody ever did. His phone buzzed. Text from Gravel. Medical examiner's office confirmed both Alcott and Morse scenes flagged for secondary review. It's moving. He sat with that for a moment. Cole Morse had driven a mining road and not come home. He'd seen something he wasn't supposed to see, and he'd stopped taking the work, and within months he'd been dead. And Della had spent 7 weeks in being told it was a civil debt matter, carrying the weight of it through 2 more months of winter while Harlan Briggs managed his calendar entries. The system wasn't evil. The system was slow and careful and built to protect process because process, when it worked, protected everyone. But slow and careful and built to protect process left gaps where people fell through. People fell through those gaps at the exact moment the system was least equipped to catch them. The brothers hadn't replaced the system. They had stood in the gaps. He finished his coffee, left a 20 on the counter for a $6 cup, walked out into the cold. The snow had stopped. The sky over Copper Hill was clear and enormous and bright with cold stars. The kind of sky that only exists in places with no ambient light and temperatures that chase everyone inside. He started the engine. The rumble settled into his bones, familiar and grounding. He didn't look back at the station. But the photo of the hospital bracelet was still on his phone. He'd be keeping it there. 7 months later, June Morse started 2nd grade at Copper Hill Elementary. She asked to walk herself to the bus stop after the first week. Della led her and stood at the window and watched, and June walked the 40 feet from the front door to the corner, with the specific confidence of a child who has been told, by enough adults she trusts, that the world can be a place she moves through rather than survives. She didn't look back to check if her mother was watching. That was new, and it was everything. The wrongful death settlement, $247,300, unfrozen in month 3 after Patricia Hearn's motion prevailed, and the fraudulent trusteeship was legally dissolved, had been placed in a structured account under Della's name with Michael, June, and Arlo as named beneficiaries. It was not enough to undo the 7 weeks they'd lived through. No dollar amount is calibrated for that, but it was Cole Morse's legacy reaching his children the way he'd intended it to, which was the thing Harlan Briggs had decided mattered less than his own arithmetic. Knotwood came by the house on Eastbrook Lane twice a month through the spring. June talked to him sometimes. He never made a production of it. He'd arrive, have coffee with Della, and if June wanted to sit in the kitchen, she sat in the kitchen. She talked when she felt like it. She didn't when she didn't. He brought books occasionally, leaving them on the table without comment, never asking if she'd read the previous one. She always had. Arlo got a dog in April, a shelter dog, 3 years old, medium-sized, the uncomplicated, affectionate kind. He named it Wheels for reasons no adult could fully determine. Wheels slept across the foot of Arlo's bed every night. Arlo stopped waking up at 2 a.m. The chapter's Angels Watch program, formalized in the months after that Thursday night, built from the infrastructure that already existed in how Ezra McCready had been running his chapter for 11 years, processed 31 cases in its first operational year. Not all of them were fraud. Some were domestic crisis, some were housing emergency, some were children whose school had flagged something and whose parents' calls to county services were in queue behind 100 other cases. The program's protocol wasn't complicated. Show up, stabilize, connect to legal and medical resources, fill the gap while the system caught up. 31 families, 29 outcomes that could be called safe. The two it couldn't reach stayed with Ezra in the particular way those things stay with you. Not loudly, not obsessively, just present. The names in a part of his memory that didn't fade. 3 years after that Thursday night, Della Morse took a position with Garrett County Victim Services. She was 32. She'd completed a paralegal certification in 18 months, working evenings after the children were in bed, with a focus on probate law and estate fraud, specifically the mechanisms by which fraudulent trusteeship gets filed in rural counties with limited courthouse staff and close-knit community networks. She knew those mechanisms from the inside in a way that no textbook teaches. Her supervisor on her third week referred a case to her, a 41-year-old woman in a town 30 miles east of Copperhill, recently widowed, being pressured by a property management company claiming her husband had left an outstanding commercial debt. The woman had been to the sheriff's office. She'd been told it was a civil matter. Della read the case file twice. Then she went to meet the woman. She recognized the look before she was 10 feet inside the door. She'd worn it herself for 7 weeks, and she knew what it looked like from the inside. The specific combination of terror and exhaustion in the face of someone who has been failed enough times to stop expecting anything, but hasn't quite given up yet. The face that keeps going because the children are watching. Della crossed the room. She sat down. She said, "I want to hear everything from the beginning. I want to hear what the phone call sounded like. I want to hear what they told you when you went to the sheriff's office. Take your time." She didn't tell the woman about her own story that first meeting. That came later when it would be useful rather than self-referential. What she offered instead was the thing nobody had offered her for 7 weeks, a person in the room who already believed her. The woman's name was Margaret. She had 2 children. She had done everything right. Della listened to all of it. She took notes. She made 2 calls before she left the office. The case resolved in 49 days. The thing I need to say at the end of this, if you've stayed with me through the full length of it, is something I want to say carefully, because I found that this kind of story can be misread. This is not a story about bikers being better than the system. It's not a story about 97 motorcycles riding to the rescue while everyone else failed. The Montana Attorney General's office, the FBI field office in Billings, Patricia Hearn's legal work, Dr. Ortiz's clinical judgment, the county medical examiner reviewing 2 old accident files, all of that was the system working slowly, working carefully, working the way a system built to be fair to everyone has to work, which sometimes means working too slowly for the person who needs help right now at 11:23 on a Thursday night. What happened that night was this. A woman did everything right, and the system needed 14 more months to be ready to help her, and she had 40 minutes of survivable warmth left in her infant's body. And there was a man standing outside a gas station who had learned from 2 combat deployments in 11 years and a nephew whose trail went cold in 2009, that the space between what the system can do and what a person needs right now is not empty. It's full of choices, his or someone else's. Every time. You don't need 97 motorcycles to make that choice. You don't need a cut or a road name or 11 years at the head of a chapter. There is someone in your orbit right now. Maybe a neighbor, maybe someone you work beside, maybe someone on your street whose curtains you've never seen open, who has been doing everything right and hitting walls. You probably already have a feeling about who it is. You've noticed something you have explained away once or twice. The weight they've lost, the way they flinch at a sound, the excuse they gave that didn't quite account for the bruise, the child who seems too careful, too quiet, too practiced at making themselves small. You don't have to fix anything. You just have to be the first person who says out loud to that specific human being, I see you, I believe you. What do you need right now? Sometimes that's the whole difference. Someone who asks the uncomfortable question instead of choosing the door locks. Someone who stays in the space rather than stepping around it. Someone who decides that another person's crisis is not an inconvenience, but an invitation to be the thing you needed once and maybe didn't have. If this story moved you, subscribe to Grace Riders and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell me, when you needed someone, who showed up? Or if no one did, tell me that too. Because that's part of this wise story as well, and you deserve to have it witnessed. Be the person who shows up before the paperwork clears, before the calendar runs out, before the 40 minutes are gone, because Della Morse is alive. Michael is alive. June walked herself to the bus stop and didn't look back. And it started with a man setting down his coffee and 8 words in a blizzard, and the simple decision to be a wall that faces outward. It is 11:23 p.m. on a Thursday in Copper Hill, Montana. A woman with a 3-week-old infant and 2 small children is crossing 34 feet of ice asphalt toward the scariest-looking man in the only lit building for 11 miles. She stops twice, breathes, keeps going. The fluorescent pump light catches the hospital bracelet on her wrist as she shifts the baby to her left arm. The light catches the split toe of her sneaker, the cold so sharp it has its own smell. She has 40 minutes. She doesn't know that yet. He does, 2 seconds after he sees her face. And this one time, someone was standing there to answer.